Hello everyone and welcome back to Foundational JavaScript. I'm Gray Lewis. This is video 1 for section 5, and today I want to introduce you to the concept of the DOM, or the Document Object Model. So when we think about JavaScript, we really think of the ability to bring interactivity to web pages. And while JavaScript can let us, we've already seen how we can use JavaScript to write functions and logic. We haven't quite touched on how we can use that logic to directly manipulate a web page. So when we have something like a web application that's dynamic to data and is rendered on the basis of data or user interactions, we need to be able to actually go ahead and manipulate the contents of the page based on that interaction. And that's where the DOM comes in. So essentially, the DOM is a standardized platform agnostic API specification. So you can think of it as just an API that connects JavaScript to the HTML content on a web page. But the DOM itself is technically not a particular implementation of an API, but a standard to which an API should be built. So Google Chrome, for example, exposes a DOM based on the DOM standard that all web browsers base it on, but they have to implement the standard because it is a platform agnostic specification rather than an actual instantiated API. And the DOM, much like JavaScript itself, needs to be able to be interoperable between web browsers. And that's where WhatWG and the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, that's where they come in to tell us exactly how the DOM should work. And what they've determined is that the web page itself should be represented as a hierarchical structure of nodes and objects. So we have elements which are hierarchically ordered and understood through their relationships to each other. So we have a parent, and then we have a child, and there can be as many, and those children can have children, and etc., until we have a tree of elements on a web page. And then additionally, what the DOM does for us is exposes methods to directly interact with these elements in this hierarchical structure. And we do that through methods that are attached to the window and document objects. So on the window object, for example, we have the scroll to function where we can cause the browser page to scroll to a certain point. And then on the document object, for example, we have a method like append child or create element. And these are going to allow us to generate elements, specify where they are in the hierarchy, and etc. And as we go into the next couple videos, I will be using examples to really illustrate these concepts. But yes, the main takeaway that you really need from this is that the DOM is really just an API that we take advantage of using JavaScript, and it allows us to manipulate the contents of the web page, even manipulate the CSS of the web page, and pretty much manipulate any aspect of the web page that we can imagine. So yeah, I'm excited to start really digging into this, and in the next couple of videos, we will perform a deep dive into how to practically implement projects that take advantage of the DOM. Today, I want to build a little bit on the concept of the document object model by giving a little demo of how to actually go about writing the code to interact with the DOM. And as you can see here, we are starting with a little piece of dummy data. You can imagine that this was imported from a JSON file, for example, but today, for simplicity's sake, I'm just defining it as an array in our code. It is an array of objects, with each object representing a person with 3 properties: a first name, a last name, and a birthday. And we're going to be generating a little list, element which contains these properties. And yeah, so let's just go ahead and get started. I also have a little default styling that I've just written up quickly just so we can have some more visibility when we're looking at the output of the code. So What we're going to want to do is, first of all, we need to write a little boilerplate code which will just wait for the actual document to load and then run our code. So here I'm adding an event listener, which we'll actually cover in more detail in the next lesson. But really all we need to do is just include this line of code with a callback function, which will go ahead and query the document for the container element and then append the elements that we're going to be generating. And as such, we're also going to go ahead and put in a container element in our body here. So this is really just some boilerplate code. Next lesson, you'll understand what this means. We just need to have that here for the purposes of today's demonstration. So what we need to do is we need to take this array and we need to map it to elements. So a really great way to start would just be to actually define that person elements array by mapping the people to a function that will transform that into an element. So firstly, I want to take these four elements here, which I'm creating one by one, and assign them to a constant. So the first thing is going to be our container element, essentially our unordered list. Then we're going to be making elements for the first, last name, and birthday. And then we need to go about actually inserting the content. And actually, as you can see here, what we are doing is, as we discussed in the last video, using the document object, which the DOM exposes for us. And we're using the create element method, which is attached to that object, with the parameter li or ul. And as you can imagine, this essentially corresponds to the name of the element as it would be in HTML. So that's how we create an element. Now we simply need to set what is called the inner text property. So what that means is if we go ahead and use the first name element and then we do inner text, we are actually modifying the text inside of it pretty self-explanatorily. And all we need to do is assign that to a string. I'm going to use a template literal here to create a little label, and then I'm going to insert here the actual value associated with this person's first name, as we would expect. Then we're going to do the same thing for the last name. And finally, we have a little bit of a more complex code for the birthday, but it's still somewhat simple. So what we have here is a little template literal, which takes the month and the day from the object here. So this is what's known as a date object. It has a method called getMonth, which will return a number between 0 and 11, corresponding to what month it is. And the getDate function method on the date object, which will actually go ahead and return us the day of the month. And you'll see here that we're actually using an array called month names to look up the name of the month using that number. And that's an array we're actually going to have to insert ourselves, which I'm just going to put at the top here. And it does exactly what you would imagine. It allows us to look up an index between 0 and 11 and return the name of the month. And I think that kind of explains it so far. So we are generating a little text string to insert as the text within 3 elements: the first name, the last name, and then the birthday. And then lastly, we essentially just need to append each of these elements to that attribute list that we defined up here, which will then insert them into the hierarchy. And then we just need to return that full list. So now, for each person, we are generating an unordered list with 3 child list items. We are quickly inserting a string which is generated from the data, the properties on the person object. And then we are appending those children to that attribute list element that we defined up here. And then we are returning it. So each of those per people will map to an item in the array of elements. And then this will do the work of actually inserting those into the container. So if I go ahead and open this with a live server, we can take a look at what we've accomplished here. And indeed, you'll notice that it has worked pretty much exactly as we would have expected it to. So we have 3 unordered lists, the children appended in accordance to the append child method, and then those 3 unordered lists that we've generated appended to the container. So this is quite a bit of content that we've just quickly covered here all at once. And it's perfectly okay if you know there were some things that you maybe didn't quite grasp watching through this video for the first time. That's absolutely fine. What you really need to remember is just sort of the pattern for interacting with these things. So it goes that we are consuming the data that we need to generate, and we are somehow generating a set of elements from that data, and you're going to use, these are some pretty common methods, so you should probably remember the create element method and the append child method. And we are, also editing these properties as is modeled by the document object model. So there is an almost infinite amount of information that you can learn about the DOM, the DOM, the document object model, and all of the different methods and properties that it allows us to use to interact with the HTML. But you're going to be sticking to a few pretty common ones for the most part, and you can always just Google it to figure out what you need to do. As with everything in coding, but I think especially when it comes to HTML and CSS, things get a little bit finicky and specific, and sometimes they don't work as well as you want to. And most of the time it's a pretty simple Google search which you can answer with just 1 or 2 searches. How the document object model deals with events. So events basically allow us to handle user input largely, and also anything else that might happen as an event on our web page. So you can imagine maybe a user is scrolling, maybe a user clicks a button, maybe a user zooms in. All of these different actions that can be taken on a web page are handled using DOM events. So we just start with our quick boilerplate here. Today I'm going to be writing us a little counter. So what we're going to be doing is just a quick little example which will handle a button press by inserting another element into our page to keep track of how many times we've pressed a button. And as usual, we're going to go ahead and create a script tag in our head, and we're going to do a couple simple things. First of all, I'm going to initialize a counter variable which will handle counting how many times we click. Second of all, I want to copy in a little array here that I have for looking up the English word for how many times we've clicked. So once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. And then I'll show you how we'll handle the cases that go above 5 times with a nice little syntactical tip that I have for you. And then one final thing we need to do, we are going to attach a onLoad function, which essentially just means we're going to wait until our content loads before executing the code inside of this function, this arrow function. And then now we get into the actual meat of it. So first of all, we need to create a container to contain this content that we're talking about. Correspondingly, we're going to actually have to define a div called a container. And then we are going to go ahead and create a button, and we're going to do the same thing. Here we don't really need to do a class in the selector because I'm just going to actually create a button here, and because there's no dot as we've covered before, it will just correspond to the type of element that it is. And then lastly, and this is where the magic is, we are going to use the add event listener function. So the add event listener function is a method which is attached to all elements in the DOM, the document object model. So we are able to attach all kinds of listeners using this function. And the first parameter that this function is going to take is the type of event. So you can even see that VS Code is giving us some tips here. The type click. So that's the first parameter. What type of listener are we looking for? And we are using the click type. And of course, there are many other strings which would correspond to different events that would happen to this element. Then we're providing it an arrow function as a callback. I'm going to quickly create an element called the notification, and I'm going to use the create element method on the document object to do that. And then we're going to dynamically set that inner text as we did in the last lesson. And here is where things are going to get a little bit interesting syntactically. So we are going to do a template literal. First of all, we're going to look up the index in the amounts array with our counter value. So as you can imagine, that would correspond to once for 1, twice for 2, or once for 0 rather, twice for 1, etc. And then here is the cool little trick I want to show you. So this is called short circuiting, and what this is essentially, if we reach a point where the value that we're looking up is no longer defined, this OR, logical OR operator, is going to allow us to sort of default to some other option. So here I'm going to say, we're just going to put straight in the counter variable and then times. So if we go above the amount of above 5 really, then it will start just saying 6 times, and it won't even use the word, it'll just use the number. So this is, yeah, just a nice little trick that you should definitely remember for when you're doing things like defining variables or inserting values that might be undefined within your code. You can quickly do this logical OR operator to take advantage of what's known as short circuiting. And then lastly, we're going to just quickly increment the counter value and then append the notification to the container element. And if we go ahead and open this up with our live server, we will see that indeed we have a button here, and as I click it, it is generating the text exactly as we would expect. So let's quickly summarize. We have what is called the add event listener method, and it is available on all elements as that are part of the document object model. So when I make an element through, say, the create element function, or I query the page for an element, any of those elements that are returned to become variables have this method attached to them. And then we're able to supply what type of event we're trying to listen for and a callback that will be executed once that event fires. And yeah, through that we're able to handle all sorts of different things that might happen on a web page. This is one of the most common use cases where we're just listening for the click of a button. And something that's even interesting about this is that we wouldn't even necessarily have to use a button element to capture the click function. We could actually use the click event on any kind of element. We could put it on a div, a span, maybe even a table, maybe even an image, anything. These events are really versatile, very useful, and they're one of the main ways that we're going to be able to create interactivity with our websites. So yeah, that's about all I have to cover for today. Thank you so much for watching. I really enjoy teaching these classes. If you have any questions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on Eduonix.com, and I will try to get back to you as fast as possible. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and thank you. Bye.